It's kind of a weird time because we started this podcast, and then it kind of seems like the world's falling apart. So sometimes I'm like, well, this is talking about maybe some topics that people think are pretty negative, but it's just a really interesting transition time for sure.
Yeah, it's. I was reading some stuff about the history of leading up to World War II and the history of leading up to World War One, and there's some weird worldwide transitionary things that were going on.
Yeah, definitely.
They're different, but they have some similar kind of footprints that we're seeing right now, and it's kind of cool to get to talk about it and actually have connections to the rest of the world that we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Because back then it was very much news driven on what information people got. Now still news driven, but there's more personal accounts that get shared for the for the almighty view or click. So
What what sort of stuff are you seeing now that kind of reminds you of what you've read in the past?
I think the one, I mean, I know, and I think we're actually going to talk a little bit about this with some of um, the Ukraine military aid,
Hmm.
but specifically World War II, though it happened for the on the United States side, both in World War One and World War II. Um, World War II, there was only there was a lot of people that were not happy with Germany at the time,
Yeah.
but no one really stood out to say anything. It, in fact, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, Neville Chamberlain, thought that Hitler was like the greatest thing, like Jesus incarnate almost, as far as a diplomat. He thought he was just such a respectful guy that he was going to help lead the world to world peace. And when Germany first invaded Poland, Neville Chamberlain still wrote it off as like, well, no one cares about Poland.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of pressure for Roosevelt on both sides. One side saying, "Hey, you need to do something about this," and then the other side was like, "If you dare do this, you're going to cause so much problems here in the U.S. because we're still fighting the Depression.
Yeah.
We're still going through some of the effects on that." And that kind of feels similar, especially. I want to say Zelensky. I'm horrible with names.
Yeah.
Zelensky's the Ukrainian dude, right? President. Um, the one thing that's been a little bit different is I don't think there's anybody that's actually stood up for Putin on the world scale in the same way that someone of a Neville Chamberlain level person. But
Well, you could say China,
true, I
because
guess,
China's definitely, I would say, backing them, and they've publicly come out and said that the U.S. is kind of the aggressor here. So
yeah, and that's actually, I mean, that also is not too different. I mean, every time you help one side or the other, you're the bad guy.
yeah, picking
That's
sides.
that kind of talk. Um, I haven't talked to any of my friends who are younger that are still in the military, so I haven't had a chance to see some of that. But there's some weird vibes, and it's the one main difference is both World War One, World War Two, entertainment was not as accessible as it is now.
Yeah.
So it is a lot easier to just not care. Before, like I said, it was an information thing. So what information was available, but now we have so much information, it's almost easier to get distracted by watching a TV show. I mean, the new Doctor Strange movie had just come out, so we got to see the multiverse of madness. What was the? Oh goodness! I mean, and then this is not one of our talking points, and hopefully we don't go into detail because I really don't want to even deal with it. But the whole Roe versus Wade Supreme Court stuff, those feel like distractions that are all maybe important conversations, important things, ways to coping and dealing with, and the rest of the world acting. But we're still kind of on this brink of World War III,
Yeah, really kind of
potentially.
things that are out of your control.
Yeah.
And that's, seeing, opening up the YouTube app and seeing Johnny Depp, Amber Heard too.
Oh
It's
yeah,
kind of like that too.
absolutely. And people caring about that
Yeah.
in a way that just is
Dumpster fire.
weird. Yeah, and that would be an interesting discussion that has nothing to do with the do next. But public perception, I guess, would be the closest to that. And perception has a lot to do with how we look at energy and finances too, right?
Definitely.
I mean, The Big Short, I think for a lot of people was a way to kind of see how hedge funds and some of the, oh goodness, the housing market, kind of how that actually worked in a way that was relatable, as opposed to just like, oh yeah, no, don't worry about it. Just let the people with the degrees or the people with the access worry about it.
Yeah.
And both the book and the movie, whichever one people prefer, that I know that opened my eyes to a lot of things that I was completely didn't know anything about, and it led to me reading a lot more about things like Bernie Madoff and some different other financial things that I would have never even explored had The Big Short not been written. So that, but again, that's those are the distractions and things that can keep us from focusing on. Look, so in our notes we have that Ukraine military aid has gone to about 15 to 20 billion dollars.
So yeah, that's what they're kind of talking about right now. Having a Ukraine aid package, and I think it was proposed 30 billion. They just signed another 150 million sort of thing with them, but I think they're really trying to get a big package going out. You think about how many weapons that buys, and like I think throughout all the Afghanistan war, we gave 60 or 70 billion dollars in direct military aid to Afghanistan. So that's, I don't really see how Russia would look at that as the US not going directly kind of war with them. And maybe that's the point, right? So um I I think one of the big reasons why Putin invaded is because basically the same natural or national security trust, brain trust, pretty much all the same people that were around in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, um, were pretty pretty much brought into the administration this time too. And we didn't do anything last time. We just kind of like let them roll through and take over Crimea. So
Right.
it was different than Trump threatening to carpet bomb Moscow. So, which is very extreme, but it's just a weird. It's a weird thing. We're putting our toe in, I think, a broader conflict, and I we talked about on your podcast back in November, December, or whatever, how I thought this year would end up in war, but with China or Russia, and weren't necessarily like sure of how it would look, but this is kind of, I guess, typical how you'd think it would play out. So
Right. Yeah, and I think there's one thing that always just continues to go on in the background with this that it piques my interest. I know we talked a little bit about when Germany attacked Russia in World War II, some of the things that were going on with how Stalin managed that side of the war, that on that front. And everything that I've read about Putin from a historical lens, not necessarily a political lens, I want to make sure to make that distinction because the perspective does make a difference on things. That there's kind of this obsessiveness that he has with World War II specifically, and how he wants to bring Russia basically to do what Stalin was originally hoping for when Hitler kind of got in the way of, being the first person to do it. And this makes me have a lot of questions about like the historicity of what may happen. Like who is going to, Putin has to have someone in mind for second of command that's going to take over when he dies, because this kind of thing, even if he's successful, like let's assume that he starts conquering the world and everything, he's not a young man. So he has to have some kind of thing for his legacy to continue to be built. There's going to be somebody there that's going to still honor Putin. And that sounds like a weird conversation, I'm sure, to some people, but there's, even though there's been elections in Russia for approximately 25, 30 years, the past 25 years of those have been more or less sham elections. The Putin, because he's technically not the president of Russia, but he's still the ruler of Russia.
Yeah.
His position's actually a lower position. And then I think they did something, I want to say in the late aughts or early teens, that made his position actually higher than president in the Russian hierarchy. Yeah, the prime minister. It's technically, but
Well,
up until then,
him and Medvedev were basically swapping spots.
right. But they also switched the stature of the position. So it'd be kind of like if Kamala Harris and Biden switched positions, and Biden's all of a sudden vice president, Kamala Harris is president, but Biden's still running everything as vice president. And even though technically president's higher, the vice president's still running it, kind of thing. That would be that's kind of what's happened in Russia, to where I think it was 6 months where the other dude that you mentioned, he ended up being in charge, but after that 6 month period, Putin was still in charge regardless of the rank. So there's some stuff like that that's just, I really think that Putin's concerned with his legacy more than anything else. I don't think he cares about Ukraine in the same way that a lot of people are considering it. I think he's looking at this. I think he's probably near his end of his life. Maybe he's been diagnosed with something. I'm making some of this up on my mind.
There's rumors, I think, that he's being treated for cancer.
And that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So it's just I don't know, like if you think it's interesting if they're at war, kind of like with Iraq and other countries, like if there's a massive power vacuum, what happens to the country? And we've talked about before, it's like, the result, and I probably wouldn't think of it this time, but the result might be worse than the status quo.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at worldwide, the elections that have happened over the past couple years, not just limited to one specific base, Merkel left Germany after a long tenure. We have 2 consecutive presidents in the United States that whoever got elected the most recent election was going to be the oldest president ever serving. And depending on what's going to happen over the next 2 years, it might be those same 2 guys. And they're not young. I mean, they both have issues that, I mean, I don't want to do ageism kind of stuff, but both of them kind of seem like they aren't mentally fit.
They're
for
around
parts.
They're around the time that it's typical for someone to die.
Yeah. And then you have what's gone on. Oh goodness, I can't think of the country offhand. There's another country where there's a long-standing leader who has recently been replaced, and my mind has gone completely blank. So of course, yeah, that helps. But you see some of these things where if something did happen to Putin, it would cause extreme weirdness in the world. There would be a weird kind of, it wouldn't be like a vacuum where it's just like, oh, let's see who conquers. So it kind of makes you wonder, I know you mentioned that China is backing Russia. Putin's like, hey, this is my last stand. I'm going to have some fun here. And you guys can rule Russia after I'm gone and rule the rest of the world. So who knows?
Well, I think yeah. China and Russia have seen themselves kind of like on the outside for the Western diplomatic stuff. And both of them are very, I'd say, commercially minded countries. Like Russia's got a pretty small economy. They're like 1.2 trillion GDP, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so small in consideration. I think they have a smaller economy than Texas,
So, like,
but
give an example of what U.S. and China approximate GDPA is, so that way.
oh, it's like the U.S. is like 25 times the size,
Okay,
and then
and China is probably
China's
like 50
closing.
times.
No, China's. I think China's GDP is still less than United States,
Hmm.
but they're closing fast. So it's well, I think approximately like 50% of Russia's um, GDP comes from natural resources. So it's really commodity heavy country, unlike the U.S. and China, who's more consumer minded and also I would say higher value added items, manufacturing and stuff like that,
Right. I
services.
I think, if anything, the fact that the aid for Ukraine has taken so long has frustrated Putin. Like, I think he was expecting aid to go a lot quicker. Because I do think he's trying to engage in World War III based on my limited understanding. And I think it's frustrating him because if we would have gone out, then it's like, oh, see, I knew all along kind of thing. Um, the, I want to say in 2020, before the pandemic really was outside of China, and we all thought World War III was going to start because we had some of the bombing that went on in early January. I think it was like January 2nd or 3rd. And um, according to John Bolton, who was the
National
NSA,
security
yeah,
advisor.
NSA advisor. Now, granted, he and Trump were good friends at that time, and then like a month later they weren't. So there's always salt on, a lot of things that perspective wise, but allegedly, according to Bolton, Trump had called Putin and was like, "Hey, I can't look weak in front of my people and stuff, so we're just gonna threaten this, and here's where we're gonna bomb. So make sure there's minimum casualties on your side,
Uh,
but we have to stand up to this." And this is one of Bolton's critiques in his book, "In the Room Where It Happened." That came out in May that year, by the way, or March, and it was based on some of that. I really think that Putin was expecting a little bit quicker reaction from Biden and company. And I think that is a frustration based on kind of this legacy he wants to show, where it was actually U.S. was the aggressor, kind of like what you're saying earlier. If China has kind of already stated that, but the U.S. might be a supply line, so to speak. But this is also exactly what happened in World War One and World War Two, where we were not officially supporting,
yeah,
Britain or supporting France, but we were shipping supplies in mass to help them take care of themselves, both defensively and food wise and stuff. So there are a lot of parallels. It doesn't mean it's going to go that same trajectory and stuff. And one of the things that I think we're going to be closer to a World War One type situation than a World War Two, because I don't think we're going to see something like the Holocaust being a factor to get people like to care about this.
yeah,
Um, the I'm not saying that Putin is or has or has not done war crimes. That's a whole other sector. But I don't think there's going to be a lot of people who currently or who are recently more Russia positive are going to be like, oh man, I didn't realize there was there was furnaces and stuff. I think it's going to be more. It's purely political, and it's purely legacy driven. As far as most of the people in the United States who might have been more Putin positive, there's not going to be a incident that's going to be like, oh, I didn't realize Putin was actually a bad guy. It's not. There's not going to be something like that that comes out, and that's going to mirror a little bit more of a World War One type perspective, where I don't think a lot of people really understood what was going on, of why there was a war, let alone a world war.
yeah. I read something that like the Pope was talking about this, and he was alluding to the fact that NATO's expansion east up to the border of Russia kind of
Mm-hmm.
instigated this whole situation.
Hmm.
I think he's considering going to Moscow and trying to communicate with them over there to encourage it. But I, yeah, I don't know. Russia's just like so small that they wouldn't be able to compete head to head with the U.S.
Right.
But if China's, it's just, I mean, you hear stories about like foreign ministers and stuff like that saying that um, Russia could wipe out major cities in Western Europe with nuclear weapons
Hmm.
right away, and you're you're just like, oh my gosh, how did it get here so fast? So,
And
I
I think that's, sorry, I interrupted you. Please finish.
well, like I don't think Russia really expected the Ukrainian people to be as resilient as they are,
Yeah.
like fighting with old weapons and stuff like that. They're, I mean, they've lost a lot of the kind of, I would say, like the key um, shipping lanes and stuff like that. But Kiev was pretty much, I would say, kind of a disaster for Russia, what it looks like, and um, they they don't seem to really like them much there. So
Really? I wonder why. Which that is one parallel to World War II, specifically in Egypt. The when Germany went to kind of conquer its part of Egypt and was working its way towards conquering the north part of Africa, the Egyptians uh, they actually held up a good front for a long time against the German tanks, but they beat them with spears.
yeah, that's crazy.
Not with other tanks, not with rocket launchers and stuff, but spears, because the way the tanks were designed at the time, the spear could get thrown in a certain angle or something inside the tread, and it basically caused the tanks shut down, like they couldn't move.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So again, we're seeing some of those kind of parallels, which it's like, it's a good thing I got my slingshot in my closet, because if they come over here, man, they're going to see a slingshot into their head, you know.
Well, someone sent me, one of my friends sent me a YouTube video the other day of, it was like a Ukraine highlight video, and I'm not one to watch
Right.
people killing people, but I was just like, they hooked up a drone and basically threw it out of a helicopter, and it had a mortar on the back, and flew it into a like a sunroof, open sunroof of a truck that had Russian soldiers in it. And
Oh wow.
I was like, this is really janky. It's kind of a ghetto tool, but it just basically toasted these guys.
And I'm wondering, like, when you saw that, because I purposely don't watch news for those kinds of reasons, especially this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Did it seem did it seem more real, less real, or did it seem like a very bad video? Like, oh man, the movies and stuff, they could have made that look so much cooler.
It
Or
was it was high def, like it was a pretty clear photo or video.
but I mean,
And
like, did it feel more real than like when you're watching a movie or something?
uh yeah, so I mean, it was, I was just kind of like, I can't believe this is going on, you know, which
Yeah.
which is like a lot of this stuff. World's pretty brutal, right?
Hmm.
And uh,
I That's always one of the things that I'm growing up in the culture I grew up in. There was always like, if you watch too much of violence and stuff, you're going to be desensitized to violence, and I kind of wonder that sometimes. You know, it's if someone saw that and they'd be like, "Ah, man, that's not as cool as what Sam Raimi did," you know, or something. You know, Steven Spielberg could have made that look a lot cooler, or something like that. Or I guess more, it would be not those guys. It would be the dude Ridley Scott. You know.
it's
um,
it's kind of like sports too, you know, having people practice on video games, like
yeah.
I guess like car racing is a good example.
Hmm.
It looks pretty much like they're using the same the F1 guys, for instance, they're using the
Right.
same wheels that they do in that and simulator. So just the heat's different.
Yeah, get in that bodysuit, get in a small little
Yeah.
compartment that you and I would have a very difficult time fitting into.